If you want to understand modern art, it's a good idea to take a look at the various schools and movements that came before it. Art history tends to be broken up into a procession of movements or isms. Romanticism, Neoclassicism, Cubism, so on. Of all of these isms, perhaps the most important to understanding modern art is Impressionism, a style of painting that began in Paris in the mid to late 19th century. Today, Impressionist artworks are almost universally admired. They fetch insane prices at auction, and the artists involved have become quite famous, among them household names such as Monet, Degas, and Renoir. It is interesting to note that despite how admired Impressionism is today, at the time it was created, almost everyone, from critics and the art establishment to the general public itself, hated it. You may look at these paintings and wonder how anyone could possibly hate them. To our eyes, they seem quite pleasant and generally inoffensive, a far cry from the shock art that elicits similar reactions today. And yet, the critics at the time attacked Impressionism as if it were an existential threat to their very way of life, which in fact it was. For as innocuous and innocent as these paintings seem, they signal the death of the old artistic systems and the beginnings of something new, which would eventually come to be called modern art. Understanding Impressionism is therefore key to understanding modern art itself. So today, we are going to take a look at the Impressionists, their artworks, and the rapidly changing society they inhabited to try and understand why they were reviled then and adored now. The beginnings of Impressionism can be found in the French Academy of Fine Arts, which in the 19th century held sway over all artistic production in France. The Académie des Beaux-Arts, or something like that, was a government organisation that trained artists, ran exhibitions, and awarded the major commissions. The Academy held a lot of power over artists, but by the middle of the 19th century, some problems with the system were emerging. Like many other institutions, the Academy disliked change. They were pretty dogmatic about what subjects and techniques were acceptable and staunchly opposed to dissent in the ranks. At the same time, however, French society was undergoing drastic changes that would soon be felt in all walks of life. These changes came in the form of advances in the sciences, industrialization, and economic developments which led to the emergence of a new middle class. This in turn led some artists to begin shifting away from the traditional subjects of the Academy, which mainly focused on myth, biblical stories, and history paintings, towards artwork which incorporated more modern subjects and techniques. Some of these modernizing artists included Gustave Courbet and Edouard Manet, both of whom were attacked by the academies because of their increasingly modern styles. This would mark the beginning of a divide between the traditionalism of the Academy and the changing interests of artists. This divide showed most prominently in the works that were being submitted to the annual Academy exhibition, the Salon, which was the major event of the year for artists, where they could show their work, gain recognition, and make sales. From about the 1860s onwards, the works that were being submitted to the Salon began to feature more and more modern subjects and different compositional styles. The Academy's response to this was to resoundingly reject these aberrant works. These strange new paintings didn't follow the academic style, and so they could be easily dismissed, or so the Academy thought. By 1863, the amount of work that was being rejected from the Academy show was staggering. More and more artists were making work that was considered non-traditional, and in response, the Academy cracked down even harder. As you can imagine, this was a terrible way to deal with the matter, as all it did was draw public attention. The outcry led Napoleon III to decree the creation of the Salon de Refus, a show of all the artwork which the Academy had rejected, with the admirable goal of letting the public decide for themselves if this emerging modern art was any good or not. The Salon de Refus attracted huge crowds. Each day, thousands of people attended the exhibition, and while many of them came to laugh at or scorn the works, many more were intrigued. Among those works shown were paintings by Manet, Courbet, and Whistler, whose work would inspire a group of young painters to begin to similarly disregard the academic traditions. This group included Claude Monet, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Alfred Sisley, and Frederic Bazille, all of whom would go on to become part of the nascent Impressionist movement. These young painters were impressed by the non-traditional subjects and techniques of the refused artists, and in particular the subject of landscape painting, a genre that was considered a lesser subject by the Academy. The young Impressionists would take trips out to the countryside to paint and study the landscape, where, in addition to painting the everyday world as Courbet had before them, they also paid close attention to the effects of natural light, the depiction of which would become a core tenet of Impressionism. Academic painters worked for the most part indoors and relied on traditional lighting schemes and techniques to create their realistic effects, rather than direct observation. The Impressionist painters would begin to move away from this as they found that working outside led to brighter and more vibrant paintings than the traditional methods of studio painting. Painting outside was also made practical by the invention of paint tubes, which made the transportation of pigments much easier. Before this, artists who wished to transport paints had to use animal bladders to do so, which was not very convenient and something most artists thought of as taking the piss. Besides imparting colour and vibrancy to their works, there was another reason for Impressionists painting outside. It let them depict firsthand the rapid changes that were taking place in both the countryside and the cities. This was the era when Paris was being reshaped into the city we know today. The medieval boroughs and winding streets were cleared to make room for the bright wide boulevards that would characterise a modern city, and conveniently, make revolutionary-style barricades impossible. This reshaping also gave us the first instances of many urban spaces that are common today, such as shopping centres, factories, offices and cafes. All of this was accompanied by an explosion in population as people moved from the countryside to the city in search of work and a better life. Surrounded by this never-before-seen swell of people and construction, the Impressionist painters would find a slew of modern subjects to paint. Painting outdoors was thus not only valuable for the effects of light and colour it imparted, but also for the slew of new modern subjects it provided. A good example of this painting of modern life is Renoir's Dance at the Moulin de la Galette. Renoir, who started out as a professional ceramicist and amateur anti-Semite, has become the target of somewhat fashionable hatred these days. He is mainly known for his syrupy paintings of female nudes, who all share a bad case of same-face. But his most well-known work in regard to Impressionism is this picture of the newly affluent leisure classes enjoying a Sunday dance at the Moulin de la Galette, a fashionable spot where professionals on their day off would come to dance, eat, drink, solicit prostitutes, and generally partake of high society. Renoir painted this canvas on location over a few sessions and captured a sense of light, movement and life that was evocative of the new bustling city. Despite the modern subject, he constructed this picture with some very traditional methods, arranging figures in triangles to lend stability, as well as placing contrasting areas of light and dark beside each other. The overall composition has a sort of modernistic snapshot feel to it, characteristic of many Impressionist paintings that would set them apart from the more artificial compositions of the Academy. Rather than depicting allegorical figures as the Academy painters did, the figures in this painting are based on real people. They wear current fashions of the day, and interestingly many are based on artists, writers and critics of the time. Conspicuously absent, however, are Renoir's Impressionist peers. Instead, the notables present are members of the Academy and other established cultural bigwigs. Perhaps Renoir hoped to flatter them, or more likely his Impressionist mates, who are still mostly unsuccessful, could not afford to attend such luxurious events. Renoir's painting would become emblematic of Impressionism as a style, because it focused on the modern life of Paris as well as embracing the Impressionist techniques of depicting light and movement. Another interesting fact regarding this painting, which will tell us a whole lot more about the change in perception of Impressionism over time, is that nearly a century later it would become the most expensive painting ever sold. The story behind this is quite interesting and very relevant to understanding Impressionism. To understand this, however, we will have to cover some other things first, so for now, keep this fact in the back of your head and we'll come back to it later. The snapshot-like quality of Renoir's work reflected another change modernism had brought about, a technological one in the form of photography. Photographs offered a much quicker and cheaper way of recording portraits and events than paintings ever could, which almost overnight eliminated the need for portraits and history paintings. People and events could now be documented with the press of a button, rather than a labour-intensive painting. Once photography became widespread, it started to seem that the intensive academic approach was not only outdated, it was inefficient. The Impressionist painters, by contrast, had no such problem. Their paintings were not so concerned with exact correspondence to reality, but instead in careful observation of light and atmosphere that conveyed the subjective qualities of a scene, a job that painting was much more well suited to than the more objective nature of photography. This is a small detail, but it will go on to have massive effects on all artwork from this point onwards, and was surely a driving topic of conversation for the Impressionists, who had begun to take advantage of another new invention of urban life, the café. The cafés of Paris offered a social space, where the Impressionists and others could gather to discuss their works and ideas. The role of cafés in the development of many 20th century social changes is notable, with everyone from Freud to Marx to Hitler being involved in such discussions at one point or another. The Impressionists are one of the first groups to use this new social space, and famous spots like the Café Gerbois, would play an instrumental role in the development of their works. Among the painters who were involved in these café discussions were many we would recognise today: Monet, Renoir, Degas, Pissarro and Sisley, as well as occasional visits from Cézanne and Manet. Manet in particular was seen as something of a mentor to the group, who offered advice from the sidelines but didn't participate much more than that. While their numbers were growing with the addition of notable painters like Berthe Morisot, their public acclaim was not, mostly due to the fact that they could not exhibit at the annual salon shows. This led them to something of a revolutionary idea for the time. If the salon wouldn't have them, then they would have their own show. In 1873, they held their first group show in the studios of the photographer Nadar. The show featured over 200 works by the likes of Monet, Degas, Pissarro and others. In keeping with the tradition of artists picking terrible names for everything, they went by the group name the Cooperative Company of Artists, Painters, Sculptors, Printmakers, Engravers, etc., which they also ineffectively shortened to the Anonymous Society of Painters, Sculptors, etc. These names alone were worthy of some pretty harsh criticism, which is exactly what their work received. The show was eviscerated by the critics, who saw no value in the Impressionist work. To their eyes, these paintings were ugly, rough and unfinished. The composition seemed simple and crass, lacking the historical and literary references of the academic works. Worst of all, the figures seemed ugly in comparison to the divine beauties that the academics loved to paint. Bad reviews and mocking audiences led to a lack of sales, and as a result, the show was a financial failure, each of the artists involved having to pay out of their own pockets to cover the cost. Despite the disastrous reception, the exhibition did help to solidify the new movement. The variety of different painting styles on display here conceptualized a different kind of art show, one where variety was accepted rather than expunged. Chief among these works that would set the tone for Impressionist works going forwards was an unassuming canvas by Claude Monet entitled Impression Sunrise. The painting depicts the port of Le Havre, Monet's hometown, which was then a quickly growing economic hub. Monet painted this image from a hotel room and most likely completed it in one sitting sometime in 1873, though he mistakenly dates it 1872 on the canvas. The scene shows a misty early morning view of the docks. In the foreground, we can see a dark silhouette of rowing boats, which provides the darkest tones and creates contrast with the bright light of the rising sun behind, which cuts through the mist and shines at us like a beacon. In the background, we can see the soft shapes of ship masts and smokestacks, showing us that this is a place of business and activity despite its placid morning air. Monet himself ascribed the term impression to the title simply because he was asked for a name for the catalogue. Before this, the term was already in use, in particular by the painters of the Barbizon school, who preceded the Impressionists. Its use then was to describe an artist's quick impression of a scene and differentiate such works from completed pieces. Monet seems to have used it in this way, as this painting was one of 9 canvases depicting Le Havre, and is more or less the most sketchy looking one. The critic Louis Leroy would take the name and run with it in his review of the Impressionist show, using it to mock Monet and the others, inadvertently giving the new style its name in the process. Despite the name, the actual painting is not really a great example of Impressionist style. Impressionist paintings mostly applied colour straight and unblended to preserve its luminosity. When colour was blended, it was applied wet into wet, mixing 2 colours into each other directly on the canvas. Monet here has not done any of this. He instead applied his paints in washes over a grey underpainting. This layering technique is quite common in a lot of paintings. The grey ground provides a stable layer upon which lighter and darker colours can be seen more clearly. Monet used 2 colours over this grey background, a blue and an orange, favouring the Impressionist theories of complementary colour use. The browns that we can see are a result of the mix of the blue and orange, which produces a neutral tone against which the brighter highlights can be seen more vividly. An interesting effect which is produced by this is that the seemingly brightest part of the canvas, the rising sun, is not actually the brightest part. If we view the painting in grey, we can see its luminosity is an optical illusion created by the perception of light and dark tones placed against each other. Regardless of its lack of conformity to the style of Impressionism, the name and connotations would stick, making this work the poster child for Impressionism and Monet one of its greatest exponents from this point on. A perhaps more traditional, if you will, style of Impressionist painting can be seen in the series of views of the Boulevard Montmartre, created by Camille Pissarro, which depicts the streets in various lighting and weather conditions. This is something other Impressionists would do as well, such as Monet's famous series of the Rouen Cathedral. Pissarro's paintings of Montmartre, however, are a great example of the Impressionist interest in the modern city. Pissarro was a skilled, self-taught draftsman whose structured drawings allowed him to be more loose and free with his application of paint. His brushwork can look chaotic with the patchwork of colours he produces, but it is unified through the use of mostly primary colours. Pissarro followed the Impressionist style of omitting blacks and ochres from his palette. Instead, he utilised bright primary colours and mixed what he needed from those. When we mix paint, we might find that the brightest colours are the ones straight out of the tube. The more we mix, the more impurities in the pigment diminish their brilliance, eventually producing the mud that is common to painters' palettes. The omission of blacks and earth tones and the focus on simple bright primaries helped Pissarro and other Impressionists to avoid this and increase the brightness of their works. The bright patchworks of colour in Pissarro and other Impressionist works were heightened by the application of colour theories formed by the famous chemist Michel-Eugène Chevreul. Chevreul was responsible for some of the modern conveniences that were revolutionising France at the time, most notably the rendering of soap from animal fats, which must have been a godsend considering the population boom. Chevreul was also responsible for devising a system for understanding contrasting colours. He noted that two contrasting colours would have the noticeable effect on each other of increasing their perceived luminosity. This phenomenon would also create what is known as an optical mix, where the eye perceives a colour that is not actually there. The views of Montmartre take advantage of this new theory of colour, the patchwork of brushstrokes heightening the effects and becoming another hallmark of the Impressionist style. In Pissarro's paintings, we can see this is particularly effective in depicting the modern city as well. The patches of bright colour mirror the flickering new streetlights, as well as the bustling movements of crowds that hurried through the streets. Another Impressionist work where we can see some more direct traits of the Impressionist style is this café scene by Degas. In this work, which depicts two figures in a café, we can see the everyday observed quality of Impressionist paintings, its ability to capture a subtle mood, and its focus on modern subject matter. Degas, who had been trained as a history painter, turned away from his academic roots in his 30s in order to become a painter of not history, but as he put it, modern life. What this meant in practice was that he spent most of his time hanging around ballet studios drawing the dancers. Degas was particularly interested in anatomy and physiognomy, the idea that a person's physical traits and appearance told you something of their personality. And we can see this in much of his work, which revels in the human form. Degas' skill at capturing motion and evoking a mood is quite clear. In this painting, the expressions on the figures, the way they are sitting, as well as their placement on the canvas, evokes feelings of lethargy, ennui, and angst that run counter to the social pleasures of the city that Renoir depicted. The woman is based on one of Degas' favourite models, Ellen André, and her disconnected expression here conveys a weariness that seems particularly modern. This weariness is also hinted at by her feet, which are set askew from one another, subtly conveying her uncertainty. Her male companion, whose appearance is based on the painter and engraver Marcellin Desboutin, sits leaning forwards, his gaze pointing off the canvas, as if he anticipates something or someone's arrival. Even the composition, which feels noticeably claustrophobic because of the placement of horizontal tables which block in both the figures and the overall space, reinforces this feeling of entrapment. These are very modern feelings that go hand in hand with the complexities of the big city life that Degas is depicting. The subject matter of a café, as well as the absinthe the painting derives its name from, represented the new social spaces modernization had created, as well as the vices it had brought. Absinthe drinking was seen as morally degenerate, owing to its potency and preference by alcoholics. The woman with the glass of absinthe in front of her was therefore a scandalous enough subject to make this painting seem shocking at the time. It was exhibited once in France in 1876, and after failing to find admirers, was put into storage until it was shown again in England in 1892. As you can imagine, if it was too racy for the French, then Victorian England might not have been the best place for it either. There, the critics attacked it once again for its moral degeneracy and, in their eyes, its ugliness. We should note here what they mean by ugliness. To the critics, the painting was ugly, not because of its surface appearance, but because it contained no morality. It did not condemn the drinking of absinthe, nor did it seem to tell any sort of story, moral or otherwise. It was most definitely not couched in the language of myth and moral narrative that the Academy demanded. It was just a picture of modern life and the complex emotional states that it creates in us. When we look at this painting today, we can recognise the expression as one that's common to many people's faces in cities. We can find such weary and tired expressions on buses and trains or in pubs and cafes the whole world over. In contrast, I don't think many of us have ever seen clouds of angels descending from the sky or roaming herds of allegorical figures wrapped in bedsheets, unless you're a particularly heavy absinthe drinker, that is. This difference alone should illustrate the reasons for the eventual downfall of the Academy and the rise of Impressionism. The art of the Academy didn't really depict reality, whereas Impressionism, for better or worse, did. While the first Impressionist show was pretty much a critical and financial disaster, the Impressionists were not dissuaded. They continued to hold their own annual shows, which featured a revolving cast of artists working loosely in the style over the next several years. They of course still faced opposition from antagonistic critics, but these shows also helped to draw in new audiences, new artists, and perhaps most importantly, new art dealers, who were interested in representing the style. One of these dealers, who played a major role in the success of Impressionism and whom we should take some time to discuss, is Paul Durand-Ruel. Durand-Ruel was an art dealer who became interested in the Impressionists and their works, and took a risk that most investors would not have. He began to support these painters and buy their works. Most of the famous Impressionists we know today are well known precisely because Durand-Ruel bought many of their works, including figures like Manet, Pissarro, Degas, Monet, and others. His support made many of them financially stable for the first time in their lives. In addition to this, he started many of the practices to support artists we still have today. He paid stipends, which allowed them to produce work without the worry of financial destitution. He even broke the hold of the academies and the exhibition system by popularising the solo exhibit, which was not really a thing at all prior to this, but today is commonplace. By paying his artists to produce work, and popularising this work through solo exhibits in his own galleries, he drove up their prices and their popularity. The popularisation of Impressionism was made possible by the wealthy new consumerist classes that modernism had created. Durand-Ruel found himself in the right place at the right time to buy and sell these works to a newly wealthy class of people, who now had the required money to invest in artworks. It probably helped, as well, that many of the Impressionist paintings were smaller scale, quicker to produce, and more affordable than the traditional Titanic canvases of the Academy. Most buyers could find room for a small haystack scene by Monet. Less could find space for a gargantuan academic canvas by the likes of Géricault or Ingres. This marks a turning point in the art market. Now there were other buyers for art besides the church and the state. This wider suitability to an emerging art market would make Durand-Ruel quite wealthy, and would lead to him beginning to export Impressionist works from France to the US. In America, he found a different audience, with very different tastes and, most importantly, none of the snobbishness of the academies. Of the Americans' response to Impressionism, Durand-Ruel is quoted as saying, "While the French laugh, the Americans spend." The Americans, who already had a taste for landscape art and a forward-looking attitude, would embrace Impressionism wholeheartedly and cement its reputation as the most significant art movement of the time. The Americans, in fact, would embrace Impressionism so much that many of them took to creating Impressionist artworks themselves, leading to an informal school of American Impressionism. These painters would include more notable figures from the movement's history, such as Mary Cassatt and Frédéric Childe-Hassam, among others. This rise in popularity illustrated the huge change in the perception of Impressionism, from a pariah movement to the mainstream cultural acceptance it found in the States. It also helpfully illustrated one of the big reasons for the change in the critical opinion of Impressionism from its inception to today: its ever-rising value as a commodity. When we say today that Impressionism marks the beginnings of modern art, It is often taken that we mean this in a purely artistic sense. While this is true to some extent, it is also true in an economic one. After the success of Impressionism in America, art and art production would become increasingly tied to the market forces that would shape just about everything else in the 20th century. While Impressionism was instrumental in breaking the hold of the academies over art and culture, it did so in a way that may have simply shackled it to another titanic force, that of markets and economics, rather than those of church and state. For better or worse, this is perhaps the biggest impact Impressionism had on the development of modern art. Its popularization led to the creation of the art market. Consider, if you will, that Impressionist artworks were affordable and accessible to the new wealthy classes created by industrialization. It also contained appealing, bright and colourful subject matter based in the modern world, which potential buyers could understand without needing a degree in classical studies, which academic art seemingly required in order to understand. Finally, there was its ever-increasing value. Impressionist artworks increased dramatically in price over the 20th century, which netted big returns for those who bought in early. Art today has become a commodity, and like it or not, Impressionism's success was the proof of concept. This is perhaps the dirty secret of the modern love for Impressionism. When we talk about Impressionism in art history or watch glossy dramas and documentaries about the artists involved, we tend to romanticize the movement. We talk about how beautiful the colours are, how smart the modern techniques that produce them were. We talk about how important it is to modern and contemporary art today. The subtext that is not often brought up in these discussions is that one of the reasons it is so important is not solely because of its beautiful artwork status or the plucky underdog opposition it gave to the Academy. It is because Impressionism marks the first time a major art movement was suitable for commercialization, marketing, and the new burgeoning capitalistic market systems that would play a huge role in the development of art and pretty much everything else over the course of the 20th century. Ages ago, back when we were talking about Renoir's picture of the dancing leisure classes, I mentioned that it was at one point one of the most expensive paintings ever sold. The case of this sale, and what it says about the commodification of art that Impressionism inadvertently led to, illustrates the effects of the movement's success. In 1990, Dance at the Moulin de la Galette was bought at auction for $78 million by the Japanese businessman Ryohei Saito. Saito was a keen collector of art and bought this piece alongside Van Gogh's portrait of Dr. Gachet. At the time, this made headlines as the most expensive purchase of art in history. The dark side of the sale emerged some years later, when Saito ran into financial difficulty and threatened that he would have the paintings cremated with him when he died, in order to avoid the enormous inheritance tax it would cost his children to inherit them. When the comment provoked outrage, Saito claimed he was joking, but after his death in 1997, the paintings could not be found. For a time, fears mounted that Saito had made good on his promise. Luckily, this was not the case. Instead, as it turns out, they had been sold off in a then-secret deal to a hedge fund manager by the name of Wolfgang Floty. From here, the painting's ownership and locations become a bit murkier. They still exist in private collections, somewhere, but are unavailable to public viewing. While Impressionism freed art from the control of the academies, its usefulness as a commodity has unintentionally re-enslaved it to other forces. Now, much like in the 19th century, these artworks have become the playthings of the wealthy. Only today it is investors and businessmen, rather than clergy and aristocracy. The sale of Renoir's work, and its subsequent disappearance from public view, demonstrates the new relationship to the artwork we have today. One where it is defined first and foremost as a commodity to be bought and sold, rather than a shared piece of our cultural heritage. All of this is not to diminish the importance of Impressionism, but instead to try and give a more complete view of the movement and its role in the development of modern art. As we go forward, looking at more movements that follow on from Impressionism, echoes of these economic and cultural factors will be felt more and more, and may well begin to explain some of the more bizarre behaviours we will see in 20th century art. Much like everything else, art does not occur in a vacuum, and the more we understand about the contexts that contribute to it, the more we can understand the art itself. Thank you all for watching. If you've got any feedback, thoughts or comments, I'd love to hear them. If you're interested in learning more about art history and that type of thing, check out our other videos. Upcoming videos will take a look at post-Impressionist artworks and how they follow on in the wake of Impressionism, as well as some overviews of other movements important to understanding modern art, such as Romanticism, Neoclassicism, Expressionism and Fauvism. Next month, we will be taking an in-depth look at the life and works of Paul Gauguin, an important artist who is becoming more and more difficult to discuss as he increasingly begins to look like the 19th century equivalent of Gary Glitter. So, if you want to listen to me flail ineffectually with the minefield of subject matter that is Gauguin, please join me then. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.